Welcome to Artistic Adventures. We're continuing our Hocus Pocus project, and we're on to part 9 now with Winifred. And we're going to be starting on her over-robe. This is going to carry over into another video because it took a lot longer than I thought. Also, I promised viewer Barbara that I would post some ideas that I have had and also some other suggestions from people, including her, about some things that they would like to see. And this is in no particular order and no promise that they will all be done. I just like to do things that interest me, and whatever sort of hits me at a point in time, I like to do it, and that's kind of how it goes with me. So anyway, that's the list, and now let's get into looking at Winifred. So we're going to work on this over-robe here, and this is, I think it looked like it was made out of velvet, and I found this picture. This is actually not the actual people. This is costumes that people made, but it had a nicer look of the front of it to show you that it doesn't come all the way down to the floor in the front, and it comes to a point in the back. So I found this fabric. It's more like a crushed velvet. Does have a bit of a nap, so it kind of crawls around a little bit. So I'm going to make sure the nap is headed downwards. So I got it positioned correctly. So now I'm just going to kind of measure. So like I said, not all the way to her feet and then up to the shoulders. So I want to just cut off a piece of this so I can work with a little bit easier. So I'm going to just go up here where I think is more than enough for what I'll need. And then I'm going to cut out a little rectangle so I can move it around while I'm cutting out the front part of the costume. This over-robe kind of comes together at the waist, and then it's sort of open to show the underneath part of the dress that we finished in last week's video. So we have to consider that we don't really want this to be something that goes completely around and meets only, really at the waist. So I'm sort of thinking about that as I'm trying to figure out how I want to, cut this. So this is 2 layers here. It's folded over, but I'm going to go ahead and cut this at the fold because I don't need a fold for the front part because it's open. So I'm still liking these scissors for cutting fabric. They're not great for cutting around little small places, but for cutting fabric, they're really great. All right, so there we have a piece, and basically I'm just sort of thinking about how I want the design to look. I know that I want to have the top part from the waist up sort of cut away from her from the opening, so that that front part with the gold lacing shows. So I'm going to measure from a shoulder seam down to about where I think her waist will be, and I'm going to cut that at an angle. So I'll have a little bit of an angle going away from the waist. All right. And it doesn't matter that the front below the waist is straight because that's going to sort of, I think, sort of come open as it's fitted to her anyway. So I do want it to be a little bit full. So I'm going to cut out at an angle and then up to the waist and then kind of go straight up from there. And that would be the side seam, the front side seam. Now the front part is sort of at an angle going down to the back. So I'm going to cut this at an angle. This is where my velvet started crawling on me. So I took it apart and just cut it one piece at a time. But I'm just cutting off about maybe 3/4 of an inch down and then at an angle to the side seam. And I'm going to go over here and do the same thing on this other side of the front. And then when we do the back, we'll angle from the side seams down to a point at the center back. All right, now I do need to cut out some little a little curve here for the sleeve opening. Now remember, I'm leaving an seam allowance up at the top of the shoulder there, so about 1/4 of an inch that I didn't cut out. There's a little curve there for where the sleeve is going to go. I'm not going to do the sleeves like as part of the the front and the back. I'm going to actually do sleeves that I will sew in. The sleeves on her costume are bell shaped. They do come down into a sort of wider opening down at the wrist area. But I want to lay this out here so you kind of see how this looks. So you can see that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that angle away from the waist at the neckline. And then the front will be okay. Now that's going to be hemmed. So remember that I had to allow for about 1/4 of an inch that I'm going to turn over and hem. So it's looking a little big right now, but it'll have 1/4 of an inch of a side seam and also about 1/4 of an inch that I'm going to turn under on the center front. So that'll take up a lot of that shape there. So don't worry about that being so big. So now we're going to cut out the back, and the way we're going to do that is I'm going to lay out the front on this, and remember we've got now wrong side to wrong side, so that's how we want to cut it out. And I did make sure that the nap was going down, and when I say nap, that's the flow of that fiber on the velvet, the crushed velvet. When you feel it rough, that means it's one way, and then when it's smooth, it's another way. So this would be smooth going down. All right, so I kind of cut out the outside, and I want to angle down from that side seam to a point in the back, at the center back. And I'll do that on both sides. So we'll have a little point coming down in the back. If you saw the movie, you got to see more of the costume than you see in a lot of the pictures that say you might, Google which Winifred. That tends to show just her from like the waist up. So when you watch the movie, you can see a little bit more about their costumes. And I really loved this over-robe. I'd really like to have one for myself because it's really pretty. I love this color green too. All right, so we've got our openings. Now the next thing I usually do is to do the shoulder seam, but I'm going to go ahead and cut out the sleeve. So what I'm doing is measuring from where the wrist would be, and then up to where it would sew onto the rest of the garment, and then allow about 1/4 of an inch extra for the seam allowance. And I actually ended up cutting this a little bit big, and ended up having to go back and trim it up, but I'll show you that in just a minute. So I cut it out. I've got 2 layers here because we have 2 sleeves. So it's kind of, I've got this sort of ball shape up at the top, and then it narrows, and then it gets wider down at the wrist. But I think I got it too big to fit into the sleeve opening that I'm going to have on the dress. So right here, I'm just going to cut out about 1/8 of an inch off of the sleeve, and I evened up the hem on that one. It was a little bit uneven. So that's what the sleeves look like. And I'm going to cut out a square so I can cut out that collar that stands up on the back of her over-robe. I don't know who decided that like stand-up collars meant evil character, but think about it. I mean, it's like Dracula has one, and the Evil Queen and the Once Upon a Time TV series, and I don't know. It's like you got a stand-up collar like this, you're evil. But anyway, I digress. So this is the shape of the collar. I'm going to set that aside for now. We'll work on that a little bit later. But when we do it, we'll just put the 2 right sides together, and we'll sew everything except the bottom where it will join to the dress. And then we'll turn it, and that will be the shape of the collar. So we'll put that aside, and we're going to go back and start doing some sewing on the dress part. And the first thing we're going to do is sew the shoulder seams. I find the same process is what I use generally all the time for doll clothes, because to put the sleeves in, it's easier to put them in when you have not sewed up the side seams. So I generally just do the top shoulder seams like this. So I've got the front and the back sewed together at the shoulders. And then we can put the sleeve in a little bit easier. But the first thing I'm going to do here is I want to put a dart in the back. I want to do this because these Monster High dolls have that really oddly curved back. And to make this fit a little bit better, I think it will work if we put a little dart inset. So to do that, I measured where the center of the waist is. That's where my thumb is, and then I'm going to put a pin there. So that's the center of the dart that I'm going to make. And then I put 2 pins on either side of that, and I'm just going to make a curved stitch from narrow on the outside to thicker at the middle, and this is how it looks after I sewed it. So you can see that process there. Make sure I got it focused for you guys. All right. So then I take the pins out, and I did just cut away the center part here just to make sure that it will stretch and open easily and not tug on the waist part. All right, so then we open that up, and we've sort of taken in the waist a little bit, and that's going to help this fit a little bit better. As you can see now, it's going to really curve in there at the waist. That works really nice. Okay, that's just one of the things I really don't like about the Monster High doll is that oddly curved back, but we're going to make it work. All right, so now we're going to actually go in and hem the entire front part, and that includes the neckline. So we've got the center front hemmed and the back of the neck. I just turned under about 1/4 of an inch and sewed it. All right, so that part's done, and now we're going to put the sleeves in. And I had this a little bit too pointed, so I cut out that pointy part there at the seam so that it's flat. And now we've got that little scooped out area that we're going to set the sleeve into. Those are the 2 points on either side that we're going to make, pin the sleeve to. So what I do is I take the center, put it right against the shoulder seam, and that's the center part. Then I take the 2 sides and pin those because I know that's where it's going to go. And because the sleeve is a little bit fuller than the sleeve opening, you have to kind of work this together and ease it together and just keep putting pins in it until you've got it to where it matches up and it doesn't look like it's going to have a fold in it. So I've showed you this technique before. It's called easing, oddly enough. All right, so once you get all your pins in and it's nice and straight, make sure you don't get anything underneath into where you sew it, because it's kind of a small area there that we're working on. So off camera, I went ahead and did both sleeves. So we've got the sleeves sewed in, and they look really nice. You can see how that bell shape is going to come down. And now I started to go ahead and pin the sleeve to do the sleeve seam and the side seam, but then I realized, no, this is not going to work because it's so much easier to hem the sleeve before you sew the sleeve seam together. So I unpinned it. Then we're just going to turn up again about 1/4 of an inch and hem that on the sewing machine. So once we've got that done, now we can go back and pin the bottom of the sleeve seams together. And we'll just go ahead and continue from the sleeve seam down the side of the garment and do the entire side. So I did pin this all. Sometimes I pin, sometimes I don't, but for this fabric it really sews a lot better if you pin it because of the nap. The nap tends to make it want to crawl around a little bit, but when you have pins in it, it's really a whole lot easier to sew. So if you're using velvet or this kind of pseudo crushed velvet or whatever this is that I have, it's really a lot easier if you pin it. All right, so we've got it well pinned and we can sew it, and we're going to go ahead and do both sides off camera to save time. So there we are finished, and I'm going to take the pins out, and then we can get started on some other areas of the garment. So there you can see how it looks turned inside out, and it's looking really good, exactly the way I wanted it to. So now I'm just trimming up at an angle those side seams, because we're going to have to hem the bottom of the over-robe, and those will show if you don't trim those up. So we're just going to hem that all the way around, and with the magic of editing, it only takes a second, and we're back. All right, see how I have that nice point in the back? I love that. It's a really nice part of this design. Okay, and now we're ready to look at the collar. As I said, we'll sew around the edges, 3 edges, and then leave the bottom part open. And now I'm just going to trim off those corners so that it'll turn and not be so bulky underneath there at the corner. Also, I'm just sort of snipping that curved part at the top, and it just helps it to turn and lay flat as opposed to being stretched because it's sewn on a curve. And I'm also cutting off some of the extra seam. Sometimes it's easier to sew when you have a bigger seam, but then you don't want to have that big a seam when you turn it, so you can just trim that off. I didn't really use a lot of the fray check on this. I did use it a couple of times, and I'll show you one of them. So here I am just turning the collar and getting the points pushed out with that end of the paintbrush. And then we're going to just sew it to the inside of the back. Now I did turn up the raw edges of the collar up inside of itself, just so there wouldn't be raw edges showing, but that's basically the placement. I'm going to go ahead and turn the sleeves while we're here, get those kind of out of the way so I can sew this collar on. I'm just using my paintbrush to kind of help push the material out. And here's where I use some fray check. Because of the point of the sleeve on the bottom, I had to cut that really short, that seam, at an angle upward so it wouldn't stick down. So I'm putting just some fray check on it. That really helps to keep it from fraying, but also it sort of hardens it a little bit and sort of keeps it out of the way. I don't know quite how to describe that, other than it just kind of helps to keep it where you want it, I guess, that little bit of seam down there. But I cut it pretty short, so put a little fray check on that. And then I went over to the other side, other sleeve, and did the exact same thing. And the part that you'll miss is the part where that bottle got stopped up again and I had to stick a needle in it again. Alright, so just that little bit there. I think that's the only time I used the fray check in this whole video, which is kind of nice because I end up usually using it for most fabrics. But this doesn't really fray that much, so it's pretty nice. Alright, so we got that sleeve turned. And now the sides there where it comes in at the waist on the side seams, I'm just trimming those a little bit just to help it not pull so much when I turn it. And I did that on both sides. So when something curves in, you just, like this is sort of curved in, you just sort of trim it down, just do a snip. When it curves upward, you put a V cut. Hope that makes sense. But this just helps to give it the pulled in shape instead of tugging it down and looking pulled. Okay. I did actually end up losing one of my segments of the film, and I'll show you a little bit later where that happened. But here's where we are so far, and it's looking really good. So now we're going to go back and sew the collar into the back. And just get some, I'm using like a really dark green to match the fabric. And like I said, I didn't want to sew it with the raw edges because I didn't want it to look really unfinished and start fraying. and it was long enough that I decided I would have plenty to go ahead and turn those rough edges in. So that's what I'm doing right there, just turning the edges in. And then I put a pin in the center to hold it in place to help me sew and also to keep it turned under. And then this fabric, because it's, fuzzy, it doesn't really show the thread, which is really great. So, I just basically did a whip stitch and sewed that onto the back, and you really can't even see it, which is wonderful. I did put my knot up inside where I turned that fold under, though. But I just went back and forth and sewed that on, and we'll speed this up just a little bit so it's not super boring. And I hope you guys all had a happy Easter. I had a great Easter. Went to church this morning and did some singing and some bell ringing. It was a lot of fun. Got to see the kids with all their Easter dresses and stuff on. So anyway, happy Easter to everyone. All right, so we finished sewing that on and tied a knot, and we have the collar sewed on now. And that looks great. I'm happy with that. Now for the next part, we're going to sew some gold trim on to the edge. You see this? At first I kind of thought it looked like little gold balls, but then I almost thought it looked like piping, like cord. And you could do either one, I think, but I happen to have this gold cord. It's elastic, and I already had it on hand. I didn't have to buy it, and I didn't have any little gold balls. But I think you could do either one, whatever, helps. And I did put some glue on the end of the gold to keep it from fraying, because it does tend to unravel since it's like gold thread wrapped around an elastic cord. So I'm starting at the very back where the point comes down at the center back, and I'm not sure how far around this one piece will go. I have a couple of pieces of this gold elastic. So what I'm going to do is use the dark green thread that matches the fabric and just sort of space it out so that you sort of see the green against the gold, and that will give it that look of, the sort of separation of the gold that almost would make it look like beads almost from, if you weren't looking at it real closely. Now the first couple stitches there, I did go through the gold with the needle just to make sure it held it in place. And then from there on, all I did was go over it. So I'm just sewing it right on top of the green fabric. And I did it fairly close together so it would resemble that separated look that almost looks like beads. Sometimes my thread was not cooperating with me and wanted to go somewhere else, but that's the adventure. All right, so I'm just positioning it like you can see, with sort of holding it with my thumb and then making sure it's right on top of the edge. I don't want it to go behind it. I want it to be right on top, and that way it will look more like how the picture looks. And you can kind of see there that the darkness of the thread against the gold kind of gives it that corded look, or almost like it's separated. So I couldn't really tell from that picture. I might go back and look at some more pictures, but it really doesn't matter because, we're doing this to make it look like the character, and whether it's beads or not, I don't think that's going to make any difference. It's still going to have gold trim, and it's going to look like her. So it's an illusion. It's all an illusion. We try to get as close as we can, but sometimes it's not possible. And also, I didn't want to have to go out and buy something else when I have this on hand. All right, now that's where I lost some film. But anyway, I got the whole thing sewn on, and I thought it looked really nice. But now I'm going to work on the little she has like, it looks like a belt or something that has these green stone and gold trim. So I had this thing. It's a jewelry thing that I cut apart. It was like a clasp, and I cut it apart, and I put a green Swarovski crystal glued on top of it. It's got two rings, which is where I'll sew it together in the front. And so what I'm going to do is, first of all, I am going to put a loose thread going back and forth here at the waist to kind of hold it together where I want it to be. So when I start putting this gold belt piece on, it won't be so hard. It'll be in place. I just will have to sew that down. If I don't, I'm going to end up having to pull this together as I sew it, and I don't want to have to do that. So I'm just using my green thread and not pulling it completely together, just loosely putting a few threads back and forth, and then I tied it in a knot on one side to hold it. And then what I'm going to do two things. I'm going to put some thread on this, but I'm also going to put some glue on it. Yay! We're going to use some glue. I know everybody's excited. So, hang on, just let me get this in focus here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is sew across this point here where the loop, after I get this in focus, where the loop joins the body of the piece. I'm going to sew across that a couple of times just to hold it down. And that'll be right at the edge where the gold trim is. And then those two loops will come together in the center. So I'm just going to make a loop with the thread and then stick that piece through it right where that loop is, and then pull it tight. And I'm sorry my hand's in the way, but sometimes it's really hard to sew some things or actually do things when you really want to be up close to it and you can't because of the camera. So anyway, I'm going to put another loop over that just to make sure it's held down properly. And that loop actually went underneath, so I ended up having to do another one because my thread was not cooperating. Sometimes the thread really drives me crazy, especially when it knots up. You know what I mean? I know you've had that problem too, right? All right, so I did get two loops over it, and then I'm going to put another knot in the thread. Just making a loop and putting the needle through it, and then that will hold it in place and make sure that's tight. And then I'm going to go through that loop, one of the loops on the side there, and then go through the loop for the other side, so it's going to be tied together. And back through the loop on the other side, and then back again to the loop opposite. So these I'm pulling tight, so I want the two loops of the metal to be tight against each other, so I pulled those two tight. And then I'm going to go from the loops over to the other side of the fabric, and I'll tie a knot over there to make sure that the thread is secure on that side before I loop it over the metal piece. And my thread's getting tangled up into everything. It just drives me crazy. This is why I like glue. Glue doesn't mess with you. You know what I'm saying? Thread always messes with me. Alright, so pretty much now I just got the thread over there, and now I'm going to go over that area of the metal that I did on the other side to hold it down. So I'm going to go over the top of the metal and then go under the metal into the fabric to make a loop over the top of the metal. And hopefully it will cooperate this time. I think it did. Yay! Alright, going to do it one more time. just to make sure. Because I've got my thread doubled, so that's 4 threads that'll be holding it down. And so once I get that done, I'm going to tie off the thread in a knot. And then we're going to use some glue. Those of you who have been missing the E6000, stay tuned. We're about to use it. Yay! I did use it to put those green stones on, but I think that was lost in that part of the video that I lost. All right, so I'm going to snip off my thread here where I tied the knot. Now you notice something I'm having a problem with here, and that's these things are curling out because of that gold elastic. So I'm going to roll these under and pin them, and I'm not going to be able to finish this over-robe tonight because I want that curl out, and I'm going to have to leave it for a while to hopefully get it to bend in the other direction. So I'll probably end up finishing this next week. And the reason is I want to do some of the gold paint designs on the border of this that are on her costume. But anyway, here's where we are now. I have those 2 things sewn on, but I want to glue them down because they're not going to lay right just sewn on there, and I want them to be flatter against the costume. So we're going to pull out the E6000 and, yes, my favorite pointy tool. We're going to put a glob enough that it will hold it. And remember, fabric kind of soaks up glue, but I'm putting it on the back of the metal piece. I'm going to do both sides before I press it down, and then I'm going to do something that I never do, and that's not mess with it anymore. So that's the other reason I want to leave it, is I want this to be nice and glued down. So I'm just going to push it down, and I'm not going to keep futzing with it. Otherwise, I'll get the glue all over the fabric and ruin it. So I'm just going to hold it like this until it's dry. All right. Now I did go back after it dried and put that little heart shape on the other side of the green crystal, and that makes it look a little bit more like her costume. So that's a frontal view of how it looks. So I'm going to leave that side turned under and pinned, and leave those glued parts where they are. So you can see there I had to, roll that over and pin it. Hopefully that'll work after a week. I'm not going to mess with it. But just to give you a kind of a look of how it is so far, there's the front, and then I'm going to flip her over and show you the back with that point that comes down. But I do want to go back and do some of the gold designs with some gold paint on the edge or the border. So I hope you enjoyed this far, and if you did, give me a thumbs up. I always appreciate that. And as always, if you haven't, please subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Thanks, and bye.